Tonight, our program is on the West Mill Historic District, and you are sitting in one of the buildings, which is in the Historic District. It's all around us right here. And our speaker tonight is Stacy Guffey, who I'm sure many of you know. He was longtime director here and was very instrumental in setting up the Cowley School Arts and Heritage Center. He's a seventh generation Macon County, from the seventh generation Macon County family, and has worked in community and public efforts all of his adult life. Stacy and I met over 25 years ago when he was skinny and had all his hair. And, and I was skinny, I still got my hair. He is now our vice mayor, and he has been very involved in getting revitalization of downtown, getting a lot of activity going in downtown. He currently works with NC Growth, is that right? Which is out of Chapel Hill, working with local governments and businesses in planning and advancement of the western counties. So Stacy has been very important to our community. He knows the history. Almost anybody you can ask, and he can give you their whole family lineage and knows what's been going on around here for a long time. So, Stacy, welcome.
Thank you, Susan. If you could do me a favor, when we get about 5 hours and 45 minutes into the presentation, give me a little hands up. Give me a hands up when we're 5 minutes out. Sometimes I get the storytelling. But the stories won't be as good tonight as they normally would be because my mother is in the audience. So I'm going to behave. I'll limit the number of lies that I tell. Also, if I get to talking with my hands and the microphone moves away from my mouth, just give me a hands up. When I was growing up, I had aunts and uncles and cousins who lived in Atlanta, in the Atlanta area. And if you know the Atlanta area, Gwinnett County's north of Atlanta, all the way out of Atlanta, back up here to Franklin. And we've traveled down there sometimes to see them. So my mama had this mannerism when she was getting irritated. I don't know if you can see with the lights off, but she'd start doing this with her shoulder. Kind of like that right there. And so we'd be stuck in traffic. You know how it is, I-85 going into Atlanta. It's stop and go, and that her shoulder would get to going. And we'd inevitably end up stuck in traffic next to these water towers. And Mama would say, well, if this is success, I don't want no part of it. I tell that story because I'm going to start off by asking you a few questions. Susan is going to be our note taker. We're going to take some notes on your answers, much like we used to do when we were on the planning board. How many of you were born, raised here, you grew up here in Macon County? And out of those people, how many of you moved away and came back? How many of you were born somewhere else besides Macon County and you grew up somewhere else? Yeah, all right. So for those of you who moved here, and you can just one-word answers will work. Besides family, because family is an important reason that we move around. Besides family, why did you move to Macon County?
More rural.
Susan's going to write, you can write these words down.
Susan started off by saying more rural.
River.
Susan said rural.
The river.
The river.
Peaceful.
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 Beauty. The beauty, the mountains. Can you write that fast?
You can't read it. Good people.
Sorry?
Good people.
Good people.
Less traffic.
Less traffic. See, I think I know what the answers are going to be. All right, anybody else?
Married my wife.
Your wife.
Feels like home.
Sorry,
It feels like going home.
feels like going home. So I made a slide because I sort of had a guess of what y'all were going to say. Let's see, wrong direction. Oh, shoot, I was wrong. I thought that's what you were going to say. Wanted more of that. Sorry about that. I guess I messed up. I am going to figure out this pointer. So this is it, right? This is a lot of the reason that you moved here. So what we're going to talk tonight is about the importance of the historic district and what it means to you, whether you're from here or not from here, why it should be important and why it probably already is important. So that's a little bit of your story of where you're from, if you're from here or not, and why you're here. I'm gonna kill this pointer. Okay. Yeah, there we go. All right. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of my story. So here are 3 of the first ancestors that I'm aware of in my family, and these are all on my mother's side. My mother's side of the family is from Cowee. My dad's side of the family is from across the ridge in a community called Brindletown. But Thomas Shepard was the 3rd or 4th white man in the valley. Samuel Baxter Gibson was a well-known minister who came around 1800 to this valley. And then John Youngtassel Watts was the son of a Scottish trader and a Cherokee woman who was here long enough to get married and then leave his wife and move off to the overhill towns where he fought the Americans. So that's some of my tie to the Cowee community. This picture is a picture of my great-granddaddy's granddaddy, Jerry Monroe Patterson. And the picture there is Uncle Roe and Lan and Aunt Viney, people that I never knew. But I know their names, and I call them Aunt and Uncle because of the stories I heard. The stories that I heard at the knee of my great-grandfather, who heard stories from them about his grandfather, Jerry Monroe Patterson, who fought in the Civil War, who heard stories from his daddy about his daddy, who fought in the Revolutionary War, and so on and so on and so on. And it's those stories that make us feel connected to a place. And the nice thing about this place is at the corner of Leatherman Gap and Ned Hill Road, you can still see this cabin that Jerry Monroe Patterson lived in. And I can take my grandchildren, can't believe I'm old enough to have them, but I can take my grandchildren and show them this cabin and tell them stories that have been passed down to me. So it's the stories that make us feel like we're connected to a place. You're going to go the right direction. No, you're not. There we go. So across the ridge in Brindletown is where my father's family is from, and this is my great uncle Howard Brindle. If any of you are from here and you remember the time when milk was delivered, he worked for the Nantahala Creamery for years, and then later on worked down at Nantahala Lumber. So you may have known Howard. This is him out at the family farm. Howard was a lot like John Wayne in my mind growing up. He kind of had that look, and he was sort of tough and gruff. But I remember one time I saw my Uncle Howard with tears in his eyes. And that was after my great-grandmother had died and the family farm split up. And this family farm had, I don't know, maybe a dozen structures, houses, corn cribs, outhouses, things like that, that Howard had built with his own hands. And I remember standing at the fence and looking over the fence, talking about some folks in the family who had done a dirty deal. I can remember it to this day, to where they got pieces of property and they got money, and Howard said, you know, that money will be gone in a couple of months, but this land and what it means, you'll never get it back. And I'll never forget that. That stuck with me for a long time. And then something else Howard said, I call this my get off the porch moment. I've told Susan's heard this 100 times, but the other picture is a picture of a mountain that's up above the farm, and it was owned by a distant cousin way back. And you know, you grow up in a rural area, you think things are going to stay the same, that they'll never change. But little did we know, it was going to get sold off, split up, and begin to be developed. And I remember sitting on the porch, and my family would complain about that week after week as the houses climbed up the mountains. And Howard said it again. He said, we'll never get that back. Meaning the view that we had, the land that we could hunt on, the land that we could walk on. I used to walk up behind that ridge and come over the ridge, and I could come down here to Cowee. It's just one ridge over. That's when I decided that I was going to get off the porch and do something. And that's when my career of public service really began, and it's really because of Howard. I'm going to tell a story, if you don't mind. It's kind of off the subject, but I want to tell it. And I'm sorry, I'm going to use a bad word. So, among the things that Howard built, in my great-grandmother's house, they plumbed in a bathroom and built a bathroom. My great-grandmother, Mommy Pearl, would walk out to the outhouse like she had always done. So they built her this really nice bathroom. And for 3 or 4 months, everybody noticed that she wouldn't use it. She was still going to the outhouse. And so my Uncle Howard asked her one day, said, Mommy, how come you don't use that brand new bathroom we put in here for you? And she said, I'm sorry for the bad word. She said, well, why would I shit where I eat? She believes you need to go outside of the house to do that kind of thing. There we go. So among the work that Susan talked about that I do, just a little more about my story. On the left-hand side, that's a picture of the farm in Brindletown. I made a promise that I would try as hard as I could to work to put the pieces that I could back together, and have done some of that. The farm is back intact for the most part. And the other thing I've done is I stumbled into a really good deal on a building in downtown Franklin that some of you may know, where the Scottish Tartan Museum is housed, and been working on restoration of the upstairs. There's 4 apartments up there, so it's a mixed-use building with the idea of trying to preserve some of our building stock in downtown Franklin, some of our historic building stock. I'm in debt. Just to be honest with you, this has put me in a lot of debt. It's been a struggle, but to a point that I'm going to make a little bit later. All that debt is good debt. Every bit of worrying about it is good debt, because it's for people. It's for people I haven't met yet. It's for my great-grandkids and their kids and the people that live in this community. It's worth preserving some of these things so that future generations can have them. you do. You just need somebody who's smart enough to run it. So the historic district that we're in, the Cowie-West Mill Historic District, is in terms of historic districts, is fairly large. It's 369 acres. There are 67 contributing resources. That's language that the National Registry uses, and that can be anything from structures to parts of the landscape, like the river, the fields, and the mountains. The man-made structures span from 640 AD to 1954, 640 AD being the Cowie Mound and the associated town site there, and then all the way through modern structures, what they would consider modern structures, like the Cowie School. And in that span of time, you cover ancient history. There have been artifacts found through archaeological digs here in this valley that date back to 14,000 years ago. So we know that people were living in this valley for thousands of years. So ancient history, all the way through the Cherokee, who had, the Cowie was the diplomatic center for the Middle Cherokee, a very important town. If you've heard talk about Bartram, you know that Bartram gave a great description of Cowie, talked about the fact that the people in Charleston knew about Cowie. This was a really important place. And then pre-revolution, the French and Indian Wars, when the British attacked the Cherokee villages here, and then leading up to the Revolution when the Americans attacked the villages here in an attempt to weaken the Cherokee because they were allied with the British. Then through the settlement period, Trail of Tears removal, we know that now that a spur of the Trail of Tears went right through this valley on a road that's right below the Cowie Mound. If you've been down Hall Mountain Road, you've been on a spur of the Trail of Tears. African American history, this was at one time the largest African American community this side, west of the Balsams, and also one of the largest slaveholding communities during that period, and one of the largest communities of freed slaves, freedmen. So a wide span of history. I got it right. So to talk about the name, Cowie-West Mill, this is one thing I love about the district because even the name spans many periods. So in Cherokee, Ani Kawi Yi, Ani means people, Kawi means deer, Yi means it's a place marker. So it means people, deer place, literally, place of the Deer Clan is the way to translate it. West Mill, that part is named after, so if you think about this, what looks like a main street down here, these conserved properties that are along the creek, on the other end, across 28, would have been West Mill. And we'll look a little bit more detailed into that history a little bit later. The millstones from that mill, when they demolished it, were moved to this mill, which is still on Kayla Fork. If anybody here knows Kayla Fork, if you're driving around Cowie, you may have seen this. This place has some good memories for me because up until the mid-'80s, you could go there and get your corn ground in the mill. And me and my cousin Brian would fight over who got to use the corn sheller. That was somebody had to shuck it and somebody had to shell it, and we both wanted to shell it because it was a lot of fun. Those millstones that are in that mill came from France and came through Charleston and then into the Cowie Valley. So an important piece of history there. So here's a map. Laura, is there a pointer here? No pointer? Okay. Well, I'll use my hand. So here's a map of the historic district, and I'm going to describe it by telling you what the four corners here. So In this direction, you have the Cowie Mound. You're probably aware that a lot of that land has been preserved, and some of it is now owned by the Eastern Band of the Cherokee. So the Cowie Mound down to this corner where you have the Cowie School. And then coming along this line here, the other corner of it would be the Bryson Farm that's just out the road here beyond Rickman's store. And then in that direction, the Pleasant Hill AME Church, which is the top of the hill in Snow Hill. Those are sort of the ways to remember the boundary of the district. You'll notice on this map there are some different colored points, some of them being orange circles. Now those are structures that have been cataloged but not studied. And that'll be an important point a little bit later on as well. There are some other structures on here that are on what's called a study list, which at some point will be studied, and then it'll be determined whether they're eligible for the historic registry. Also in the middle of the river, you'll notice some squares. Those are the fish weirs that you see as you go up and down the river. And here's a little bit closer. So Cowie Mound, Hall Farm, Cowie School, the Bryson Farm, and then up to Pleasant Hill, and this big swath in the middle is the Leo Gibson Farm. You also see a couple, there are some contributing structures that are now gone. So for one good example here is the pedestrian suspension bridge that used to go across the river near the Cowie Mound. So what's the criteria either for a contributing structure to a historic district or a structure that qualifies for the registry? So at least 50 years old. Raise your hand if you qualify as a historic structure. Some significance, so a person, significant person and significant event, or some sort of development in our common history. It also has to have integrity. There have to be components that are still in place that retain the historic characteristics. Notable architecture is important. Historical information about, it has to be something that conveys information about history or prehistory. And keep those in mind when we look a little closer at West Mill. So what are some of the benefits? The benefit is if it's a structure or a district, it goes in as part of the National Registry Archives. So the information about that place or that structure is kept in perpetuity. It also opens up, in some instances, the opportunity for grants. And then here's an important one, the preservation tax credits, which range between 20% on the federal level and 15% on the state level, and sometimes it can be higher. It can be as high as a total of 40%. Those are important because, and I'll give you an example. One thing that we're working on in the town of Franklin is the rehabilitation of the Scott Griffin Hotel, which is in the picture at the top. Have you all heard about that project? And so one reason that it has taken so long, we did a feasibility study that shows that it can be rehabilitated, that money can be made off of that, off of the plan, the business plan. But one reason it's taken a little longer than we expected is because in order to make it work, a developer would need these preservation tax credits. And so right now we're waiting for determination from the state of North Carolina as to whether downtown Franklin qualifies for a historic district. If it does, then we'll be able to move forward with the project. If it doesn't, we'll have to rethink it. So when you're going through downtowns, I'm sure you're familiar with downtowns that have experienced sort of a downtown renaissance. You see a lot of the structures being rehabilitated and inhabited again. A lot of that work is made possible because of these tax credits. So that's a really important component of being on the National Register. The other thing that it provides is technical assistance. So if you bought a structure that's on the registry and you wanted to preserve it or rehabilitate it or restore it, then State Historic Preservation Office and the National Office will offer technical assistance on that restoration. There are also protections related to federally funded and in some cases state-funded projects. Some of us in here are familiar with that. The bottom picture is the West General Store down here at West Mill. The proposed widening of 28, there was a group of us that worked on getting the DOT to change that plan because their original plan would have taken the front off of the store and taken out the can house. And the only reason that we had any leverage was because of the historic district designation, because this building's on the federal registry. So that's a real advantage. Now what it doesn't do, and I put this in red because a lot of times when people hear that there's a structure that's going to be altered or demolished, they'll call and they'll say, but it's on the registry. It doesn't provide any sort of blanket protection to that structure if it's owned by a private owner. There's no protection. It's really up to the owner if they're gonna follow the guidelines of the registry or if they're gonna demolish the structure. And an example of that is a structure that was demolished maybe a little over a year now, maybe not quite so long. The Will West House, which was at the end, if you think of the West Mill little town center down here, think of that and look down the main street on the other side of 28 was the Will West House. This is the property where the West Mill was originally. So that house was demolished, and had some of us known about it in advance, we may have been able to, through some organizations and some fundraising, worked out a deal with the property owner to pay market value or a little more than market value to try to save this structure. But unfortunately, we didn't find out about it until just a couple of days before the demolition. And so an important thing to remember about this is that keeping these structures, again, and keeping them on the registry is purely voluntary if it's a private landowner. There are no laws that would mandate that somebody keep the structure or keep it in the kind of condition that would keep it on the registry. If you'll bear with me, I'm just going to read a little bit about the Will West House. The Will West House stands on the northwest bank of Cowee Creek, fronting Highway NC 28. It is a two-story T-plan frame house on a brick foundation with a one-story shed roof porch across the front and a one-story shed roof addition on the west side. The windows are original, with the second story stash appearing to be older than those on the first story. Some community residents say that the house was built in the 1920s, but because of the materials, it appears to fit the earlier date of 1880s, cited by other reliable longtime residents. This was written in 2000, and since then we do know for a fact that it was built in the 1880s. This house was partially restored in 1997 and is used as a private residence. I think, didn't my Uncle Connie live in that house for a while? That's what I thought. You'll see also in, I don't know if you can see it, but in this document, Will West House is numbered 2, and you'll see why in a minute. And then you have 2A and 2B, a shed and a mill site. until I haven't been down the property, but I imagine it's gone now, but up until a couple of years ago, there used to be the old foundation of West Mill down there. I haven't gone down to see if it's still intact or not. But I point that out because those smaller structures and even the foundation were considered contributing structures to the eligibility for this site for the National Registry. So where I'm reading this is from the documents that were submitted and approved to make this, to put this historic district on the registry. If you want to, you can Google these words right here, the NC listings in the National Register of Historic Places, and you can view these documents online. They're incredible because they give a broad narrative about the entire Cowee community, and then each of the contributing structures has a description and somewhat of a story that goes along with it. This is one of the title pages, and I just wanted to put that up there to say that we all should thank Susan Irvin, see her name right there, for her hard work on this back in 2000. This was approved in 2001. So when we talked about the criteria for structures and districts becoming part of the registry, there was a broad range of criteria. Another great thing about this district is that it meets so many of the criteria. Take a look at this. The historic functions from single dwelling to secondary structure, post office, specialty shops, commerce, education, school, religious facilities, cemeteries, funeraries, agriculture, storage, and then their current function, the description of the architectural classification, all the way down to Art Deco. The Art Deco comes from this school, because if you look at the front of the school out here, the entrance that you came in, you'll see an Art Deco design above the main doors. And if anybody ever finds out the story of that Art Deco design, I want to hear it, because we've wondered about that for years, why this stone structure made of native stone by the Works Progress Administration, the CCC camp fellows, why there was an Art Deco design added to it. It'd be really interesting to know that story. I'll also say that funerary is on this list because among the things down here in the main part of West Mill, and particularly on the Will West property, was a coffin maker. So at one point, there was a dentist, a post office, 2 stores, and a coffin maker. So you get all your errands run in one place. Areas of significance: agriculture, architectural, community development, exploration and settlement, Aboriginal archaeology and non-Aboriginal archaeology. It just says so much about the richness of this district. You go online and look at some of the districts around the state and compare them to what we have here in West Mill, and you'll be amazed. And here's another example. The property is associated with events that have made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of our history. And you can see that, right? The history of the settlement in this valley as people came up from the south, and then settlement by the Cherokee, and then by the white settlers, by African Americans. All these broad patterns of history. The property embodies the distinctive characteristics of a time period and method of construction that represents the work of a master, possesses high artistic values, or represents a significant and distinguishable entity whose components lack individual distinction. The property has yielded or is likely to yield information important to prehistory or history. So out of the 4 criteria, we have 3 of them here in West Mill. Another thing that makes this district special. And here are some of the structures, some that I'm sure you're familiar with from the Cowie Mound and Town Site, to the Cowie School, to the Rickman Store, to the Main Street that I keep talking about, the old post office, the Vonnie West House, and then the Will Morrison House in the background, and then the AME Church at Pleasant Hill. Again, any of these structures, you can look at them, go for a drive and look at them. I'll show you a map in a minute that you can access that will guide you on a tour of these places. The AME Church is especially nice because the door is always unlocked. You can even ring the bell when we take school kids up there. When we're going around the historic districts, that's what they want to do, is ring the bell. But something I'd point out is on the right-hand wall as you go in the door, there are 3 newspaper articles about 3 different times that the community made an effort to restore this church. And they're great stories about the community working together with the families who have descended from the people who went to this church, and some of who are still alive and active today. But also, it's fun, it's interesting to read the change in the language on how these communities talked about each other over these periods of time. So that's an interesting stop. This is the map. You can download this map as a PDF and put it on your phone or print it out at cowienc.com. That's the website of the Cowie Community Development Organization, which was active down here for years. This is in bad need of an update. A great project for Cowie School to go out and find some grant funding for, to update this map, make it more usable on something like a phone. But for people in the room, like Steve Giebert there in the back, who owe their lovely significant other a date, I recommend downloading this map, download the 43 pages from the National Registry, and make a nice date out of it on a pretty day. You can thank me later, Steve. So I want to read one more thing from the documents in the registry, and I've printed them out here. You can see it's not that big of a document, but again, it's a great read. But something that's really special about this district are the contributing resources number 40 and 41. So number 40 is a portion of the Little Tennessee River. The river played a pivotal role in the development of communities for Native peoples and white settlers. The portion included in the district stretches from its confluence with Cowie Creek and ends adjacent to the Uchella site. The Little Tennessee provided a water source as well as a source of fish. If we were writing that today, we would also add that it was an important transportation corridor for the Cherokee. Number 41 is the landscape. The rural mountain landscape itself contributes to the historical integrity of the district, because not only do the buildings of the period remain, the landscape appears much as it did during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The landscape is comprised of agricultural fields and open space at the lower, flatter elevations, rivers and creeks, and wooded hillsides. The built resources punctuate the agricultural landscape, which attests to the historical, agrarian character of the area, and the farmland is in turn framed by wooded hillsides. Curving roads follow the natural contours of the land. Difficult terrain of the mountains and the necessity for creek and river crossings led to the relatively late settlement of the area, historical isolation of the community, and slow modernization. This is something that when you gave us the list of why you moved here and why you stayed here, right there it is in that paragraph for a community like West Mill. How rare is it to see a community like this with historic structures, intact agricultural fields, resources like the river and the mound that go all the way up to these high mountain peaks. It's something rare anywhere in this country. So why does it matter? You're going to have to forgive me because these prices are a little outdated, because when I remember this metaphor, I'm thinking back to the time when I realized it. There was a time that I could only afford $17 shoes. But then there was a time where I got to where I could afford a $60 pair, but I still wanted to buy the $17 pair of shoes because I thought, well, it's cheaper. But then I did the math. All right, if I'm wearing a $17 pair of shoes and they're wearing out every 6 months, but I can get a $60 pair and they're going to last me for 3 years, well, I'm spending $100 versus $60, so that's $42 in savings if I buy the $60 pair of shoes. Not only because they were better quality, but because I treated them better because of the price. Right? This is the metaphor that I use. We're in what a lot of architects call the age of disposable architecture. We want to build something for cheap because we want to build it now. But you'll notice this. This is, if you pay attention to the kind of work that goes into county buildings, for example. County buildings that we built on the cheap that we constantly have to repair. This is one reason that these historic districts matter. I may be getting a little ahead of myself, but I'm going to tell you, I'm going to make you a bet. I bet you that a place like Cowee School, which has outlasted Franklin High School, I bet it'll outlast the next high school, and quite possibly the one after that, because it was built better. So it's important to conserve these places because it reminds us of a time when people were making generational investments. Like I talked before about the debt I'm in on that farm and that building. That debt's worth it because it's going to pay off generations down the road. And what we spend in terms of not only money, but the energy in protecting these places is going to pay off for generations. It matters because of civic pride. I can't tell you how many Cowee tags I see. People with the Cowee tags, it's in English and Cherokee and the sunshine on the front of their cars. You drive to Asheville, you see Cowee tags. There's something about Cowee that makes people feel really proud to be from here. And I'm sorry if you're from some other part of the county, I don't see a lot of Skeeter tags. But one reason people are so proud of Cowee is because of the civic pride that these structures and this landscape instills. So that's why it's important. All of that creates a connection to this place, much like the stories I told you about that I grew up with that created a connection for me. The stories about generations of people working on the land. That connection to a place which it doesn't require you to be here as long as my mom and I have. You know, that I'm not bragging because we've been here for generations, because you create that connection when you moved here. I know some of you who moved here and you love this place. That connection leads you to care about this place, which leads you to make investments here. And again, I'm not only talking about money, I'm talking about the time, the energy, and the care that you put in to this place. Sense of community versus sense of despair, you hear it all the time. The people who do polls, especially in rural areas, talk about the crisis of despair. And if you look inside those polls, you'll see that a lot of people feel that way because they feel disconnected with their families, with their neighbors, and with their communities. It's places like Cowee School, where we convene here tonight that creates a sense of community. It's places like your churches, it's places like your community clubs, and then it's your neighborhoods that you build. And think about this, when we built houses that had porches on them, and people sat on the porch, or in a town, if you build a neighborhood that had sidewalks in it, and the porch was facing the sidewalk, people had to talk to each other. When people come down here I remember the Rickman store from when I was a kid. We'd go down there. I'm going to tell another story. We were down there one day, so my cousin Brian, the one I used to fight with over who grind the corn, Gwinnett County let him out of school for a whole week for Easter, but Macon County only let me out for 2 days. And so we were staying down at Mama and Papa's so we could spend some time playing, and Papa told me I could lay out of school for a few days. And so Papa was a Southern Baptist preacher, and he loved to talk. We'd go somewhere, and Mama, he'd say, "I'll be back in 20 minutes." My Mama would say, "Yeah, in your 20 minutes." We were down at the Rickman store, and I'm sure that Brian and I were loaded up on RC dope and probably a moon pie or two. And Papa and Mr. Rickman needed to talk. I don't know what they were talking about, but they needed to talk. And so we wouldn't shut up. We just kept bothering them. And Mr. Rickman said, "You know, you're laying out of school, Stacy." He said, "If the truant officer comes along, you're going to be in trouble. They're going to make you go back to school." I didn't know what a truant officer was. I'd never heard that term. I said, "What's a truant officer?" And he said, "It's kind of like the policeman that makes sure the kids are in school." And that kind of scared me. And he said, "The two of you get down here behind the counter and be real quiet. And if you're quiet, when the truant officer comes by here, he won't even notice that you're here." So we sat under the counter for about 45 minutes, and I had all of these visions in my head about what it was going to be like when the truant officer came in. And then after 45 minutes, Papa said it was time to go. And I said, "Well, what about the truant officer?" And he said, "Well, I guess he just didn't make it by here today." I think it was the next week that I learned that Macon County didn't have a truant officer. I was telling that story because I started thinking about the sense of community. And even up until the early 90s, you'd go in the Rickman store. And it looked like a Norman Rockwell painting, right? People sitting in the back around the pot-bellied stove, people playing checkers, people talking, building a sense of community. And that's some of the things that in a lot of communities we've lost, and something that I really strongly believe we should find again. This issue matters because historic preservation is the land of strange bedfellows. It's a wonderful conservative liberal idea. Conservative on the one hand because you're conserving places. Conservative on one hand because of a civic duty. You're doing a civic duty. Conservative on one hand because it's very patriotic to save these places. Liberal on the other hand because a lot of times you're talking about other people's property being used for a common good. But you would be amazed at how well people who we think in this country don't get along very well get along when they're talking about historic preservation. It's a beautiful thing. That story, the best example of that story was, if you know about the Needmore Tract, 4,500 acre Needmore Tract up here, between Macon County and Bryson City. All of that land was slated to be part of a hydroelectric project back in the 30s. In other words, they were going to dam it up and make a lake. That didn't happen. And so eventually, through the change in ownership, it made its way down to Duke Energy, and Duke put that property in its development arm. I can't remember what it was called now, but anyway, Crescent, its development arm. And they were going to develop that into this massive development, which would have totally changed the character of this place. Well, you know who fought against that? Democrats, Republicans, at the local level, at the state level, and the national level. came together to fight against that. Put their political differences aside to make that happen, and it happened. It was to this day, to me, it's a miracle that that happened. And I can tell you, I've been in meetings around the state where Needmore is brought up as an example of how to do things, how to work together to get things done. Historic preservation, a great conservative liberal winner, I like to call it. If you're about the environment, you should know that 145 million tons of construction waste go into our landfills every year. So reusing structures, smart in that way. If you demolish a house, I think the average 2,500 square foot home, the materials from that, if you demolish it, equal about 1 million aluminum cans. So a lot of wasted resources there. So those are all reasons that it's good, and I think you know a lot of the reasons it's good because you feel them when you're in this community, when you're in this county. That's why you're here. I changed the slide on my laptop, so I assumed it changed for you, but it didn't. So I want to leave you with a call to action. So for Cowie School, I'm looking at you in the back. One thing that needs to be done in the Cowie community is some work on bringing some of these other important structures, important farms, and important resources onto the National Registry if the owners wish to do so. And the way to do that, and I'll give this out as advice to you if you happen to own a historic structure that you're thinking about putting on the registry, hire a consultant to do it. Hire somebody who's done this paperwork before, because it is, Susan can probably tell you, it's a tough process, but there are people who have done it for years and years, and they're trained, they know how to do it. I think this would be a good project for Cowie School. Cowie School has elevated its stature in this region as a resource and as a place for all things historical. I'm sure there's grant money out there to hire somebody to do it. So Cowie School, get to work on bringing some more structures into the registry and update that driving tour guide too while you're at it. I'm sure there's grant money for that. I'd be glad to help look for that. I'd volunteer for that. Support organizations that are doing the work. It still blows my mind the amount of work that Mainspring Conservation Trust, formerly the Land Trust, who submitted this paperwork, has done to preserve historic structures. There are a couple that I know of that were on the verge of either falling down or being demolished, where Mainspring stepped in, purchased those properties to conserve them. In a couple of cases, they bought the property and then listed them with a group called Preservation North Carolina. There was a speaker here, I think, last year who talked about Preservation North Carolina, where they put it on the market, but the stipulation is you have to restore it in order to keep it on the registry. Support places like Cowie School, volunteer here. Again, the more you volunteer, the more community you build, and the longer you preserve places like Cowie School. And here's an important one. We talked about this before when I talked about those underpriced shoes. We ought to be having the right conversation. It drives me crazy when I hear conversations about, for example, building civic buildings. Let's say, I don't know, building a high school or a library or a health department. And the conversation is, how can we get it done quickly and for cheap? The conversation we ought to be having is, how can we get it done so it benefits our great grandkids and their children? That's the conversation we should be having. If we need to sacrifice now to get these kinds of things done, then we should be be doing the sacrifice. That's not just what we do as people from Cowie or Macon County. That's what we do as good human beings. We ought to be building things that last. We ought to be building things that instill civic pride. And I can make a very conservative argument for that because I used to work for the county and I know how much money goes into these buildings that we build on the cheap. So let's have the right conversation. One of the most disappointing parts about being vice mayor, I really enjoy my role with the town of Franklin as vice mayor, but I'm really disappointed that more people don't show up, that more people don't organize in their communities and come and tell us what they want. I see a lot of it floating around on Facebook, but I rarely see anybody showing up to demand better. And I think it behooves all of us to demand better of our local elected officials. I'm just going to say it. I think a lot of people, including me sometimes in this room, spend way too much time thinking about national issues. Those are important, well, no matter what your politics are, I'm sure they're important to you. But there are people making decisions that affect your life immediately and every day at the local level. And people just aren't showing up to demand that they do the right thing. I'll give you an example. There's a movement afoot right now to roll back the regulations that protect your water quality and your river in this county. The watershed ordinance, soil erosion control ordinance, and the floodplain ordinance. A lot of arguments, especially with the floodplain ordinance, where they're proposing something that would raise the flood level, thereby endangering other people's property and lives. But there's another component to that. It also endangers the very landscape that we've been talking about here tonight. So that's my last call of action for you is demand better. Because if you don't, that's my Uncle Howard. He's not on his mule anymore. He's standing there in his t-shirt. If you don't, my Uncle Howard would say you'll never get it back again. And then this picture here in the bottom, that's 5 generations of my family, back when I still had hair, maybe not quite big of a belly. Demand better, because the people in this picture, they made sacrifices so I could have the kind of life that I have today. Let's make sacrifices. Let's demand better so that the people 5 generations from now can enjoy some of the stuff we enjoy today here in Macon County. Thank you.